She was kneeling beside her father's casket, whispering goodbye to the only man who ever loved her when she saw him, and an old man in a torn jacket sitting in a wheelchair in the pouring rain, struggling to open the church door. 200 people in that church. Not one of them moved, not one of them cared. So Grace stood up. She walked past her stepmother's glare, past every person who pretended not to see, and she opened that door. She wheeled him inside. She took off her own coat and draped it over his shaking shoulders. And that is when her stepmother slapped her across the face. In front of everyone, at her own father's funeral. The sound echoed off the stone walls. Blood ran down her cheek. 200 people watched. Nobody said a word. But here is what nobody knew. Not even Grace. That old man was not helpless. He was not homeless. He was not a stranger. He was her father's attorney, disguised in rags and a wheelchair, testing every single person in that room. And Grace was the only one who passed. 2 days later, he stood up from that wheelchair, walked into a room full of lawyers, and told Grace Mitchell that she had just inherited a $500 billion empire. Every company, every property, every dollar, all of it. The stepmother who slapped her was about to lose everything she spent 16 years stealing. But that is not even the real story. The real story is what happened next. When the people Grace trusted most turned against her, when her own ex-boyfriend lied under oath to destroy her, and when a dead man's trap caught every single person who deserved to fall. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, as if the sky itself knew that Ezekiel Mitchell was gone and couldn't stop grieving. Grace Mitchell knelt beside her father's casket in the Ashford Community Church, her right hand resting on the polished mahogany, her left hand pressed against her stomach where no one could see the slight swell beneath her black dress. 5 months. 5 months pregnant and completely alone, kneeling beside the only person who might have cared, except he was gone now too. The church was packed. 214 people, according to the guest list Victoria had personally curated. Every seat filled with someone who mattered, or at least someone who thought they did. Business partners in Italian suits, politicians who owed favors, society women whose grief lasted exactly as long as the cameras were rolling. Grace didn't belong here. She knew that. Victoria had made sure she knew that every single day for the past 16 years. She whispered to the casket, so quietly that no one could hear. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, Dad. I'm sorry I believed her when she said you didn't want to see me." The church doors were heavy oak, built in 1892, and they required real effort to open. That was why Grace noticed the old man before anyone else did. He was in a wheelchair, parked just outside the entrance, getting soaked. His jacket was torn at the elbow. His shoes didn't match. One was brown leather, cracked and peeling. The other was a black sneaker, held together with duct tape. His hands were folded in his lap, like he was apologizing for existing. Grace watched as the funeral attendant, a young man named Kevin, who Victoria had hired specifically for his ability to follow instructions, glanced at the old man and then deliberately looked away. She watched as 2 board members from Mitchell Holdings walked right past him, close enough to touch, and never broke stride. She watched as Victoria's eyes slid over him like he was a crack in the sidewalk, something to step around and forget. Nobody helped him. Not one person out of 214. Grace stood up. Her knees ached from the stone floor. Her back hurt. In that new way, it had started hurting 2 months ago. A deep, persistent pressure that reminded her every single day that her body was no longer just hers. Victoria caught the movement. Her stepmother sat in the front row, dressed in a black Chanel suit that cost more than Grace made in 3 months at the hospital. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Everything about Victoria Whitmore Mitchell was always, always perfect. "Sit down," Victoria hissed, barely moving her lips. Grace didn't sit down. She walked past Victoria, past the board members, past the politicians and the society women and every single person who had looked at that old man in the rain and decided he wasn't worth the effort. She pushed open those heavy oak doors, and the rain hit her face like a slap, cold and sharp. "Come on in, sir," Grace said softly. She positioned herself behind his wheelchair and began pushing him through the doorway. "There's space right up here." His clothes smelled like wet wool and something else, something metallic, like old coins. Up close, she could see his eyes were clouded, or at least they appeared to be. His hands shook slightly in his lap. "Thank you, young lady," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling downhill. "Most people just walk on by." "Most people aren't paying attention," Grace said. She wheeled him to an open spot near the back pew, set the brake on his wheelchair, and took off her own coat, the only good coat she owned, and draped it over his wet shoulders. She never made it back to the casket. The sound came first, a crack so sharp and sudden that it bounced off the stone walls and stained glass windows and seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Then the pain. Victoria's hand connected with Grace's face with enough force to turn her head sideways. Her stepmother's diamond ring caught her cheekbone, and Grace felt the skin split open, a thin, hot line of blood that ran down to her jaw. The church went silent. 214 people, and not a single sound, not a gasp, not a whisper, nothing. Victoria stood over her, breathing hard, her hands still raised. Her eyes were wild, but her voice was controlled, pitched perfectly for the room. "You embarrass this family. On today of all days, you bring some vagrant off the street into your father's funeral." Grace touched her cheek. Her fingers came away red. She looked at the blood for a moment, then at Victoria. Then she said the only thing she could think of, quietly, without anger, without tears. He needed help, that's all. Nobody defended her. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word. 214 people watched a pregnant woman get slapped at her father's funeral for helping an old man in a wheelchair, and every single one of them chose silence. Grace didn't know it yet, but the old man was watching her too, and his eyes, behind those clouded lenses, weren't clouded at all. 16 years earlier, 12-year-old Grace Mitchell stood at her mother's grave and held her father's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. Catherine Mitchell had been sick for 2 years, ovarian cancer. She fought it the way she did everything, quietly, stubbornly, with a kind of grace that made other people feel braver just by being near her. She lost the fight on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves in the apple orchard behind their house were the exact shade of gold she always said was her favorite color. For 6 months after the funeral, it was just Grace and her father. Ezekiel Mitchell, the man who had built a $500 billion empire from nothing, who commanded boardrooms and terrified competitors who had once told a United States senator to sit down and stop wasting his time, that man made his daughter terrible pancakes every Sunday morning. He read to her at night. He drove her to school and picked her up, even when his schedule said he should be in Hartford or New York or London. He wasn't good at grief. He didn't know the right words, but he showed up. Every single day, he showed up. Then Victoria arrived. She came into their lives like a warm front, all sunshine and gentle breezes. She was beautiful, 42 years old, a former real estate agent with a southern accent that made everything she said sound like a compliment, even when it wasn't. She laughed at Ezekiel's bad jokes. She brought Grace presents. She cooked meals that were better than anything Grace and her father had managed on their own. They married 11 months after Catherine's death. Grace was the flower girl. She wore a white dress and smiled for the photos because her father asked her to, and because she wanted him to be happy, even though something in her stomach felt wrong, like swallowing a stone that wouldn't go down. The changes came slowly, so slowly that Grace didn't recognize them as changes at all until years later, when she could look back and see the pattern like a trail of breadcrumbs leading into a dark forest. First, her bedroom moved. Victoria said the master wing needed a sitting room, and Grace's bedroom, the one with the window overlooking the apple orchard, was just perfect. Grace moved to the smallest bedroom on the third floor. Victoria promised to decorate it beautifully. She never did. Then the photographs disappeared. Grace came home from school one day, and every picture of Catherine was gone. Victoria explained that she'd had them professionally stored to protect them from sun damage. Grace never saw them again. Then the letters started. Or rather, the letters stopped. What Grace wouldn't learn for 16 years was this. Victoria intercepted everything. Every note Ezekiel tried to leave on Grace's pillow. Every text he sent asking about her day. Every birthday card. Every Christmas letter. Every attempt he made to reach across the growing distance between them. Victoria caught them all. She replaced them with silence. And silence, when it comes from the person you love most, is louder than any scream. To Grace, it felt like abandonment. Her father stopped talking to her, stopped asking about school, stopped showing up. She didn't know he was writing her letters every week that Victoria hid in a locked drawer in her office. She didn't know he asked Victoria every single night how Grace was doing, and Victoria always said the same thing. She's fine, Ezekiel. She just needs space. You know how teenagers are. Victoria told Grace a different story. Your father is very busy, sweetheart. He has responsibilities. You can't expect him to drop everything for you. That's selfish. Then softer, deadlier. Your mother wouldn't want you to be a burden. Grace stopped waiting by the phone, stopped hoping for a knock on her bedroom door, stopped expecting to see her father's face at the breakfast table. She became invisible in her own home, a ghost moving through hallways that used to echo with her laughter, now silent except for the sound of Victoria's heels on the marble floors. She left at 18, packed one suitcase, didn't say goodbye to Victoria, went to her father's office to say goodbye to him, but Victoria's assistant said he was in a meeting. He wasn't. He was sitting at his desk, waiting, hoping she would come. Victoria had told the assistant to turn her away. Grace put herself through nursing school, 2 jobs, student loans that felt like mountains, a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery in the working-class part of Ashford, with cracked tiles and a faucet that leaked if you ran it too long. She kept one photo of her parents on the nightstand, the one where she was on her father's shoulders in the apple orchard, both of them laughing, both of them whole. She hadn't spoken to Ezekiel in 4 years when the call came. Her phone rang at 3:17 in the morning. An unfamiliar number, a man's voice she didn't recognize, professional and careful. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling from Hartford General. Your father suffered a cardiac event this evening. I'm sorry to inform you that he passed away at 2:41 a.m. Grace sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed the phone against her ear until the screen went black. She didn't cry. She couldn't. There was a wall inside her that had been building for 16 years, brick by brick, and crying would mean admitting that behind that wall was a little girl who had been waiting for her father to come find her. He never did. And now he never would. Or so she thought. The will reading was scheduled for 2 days after the funeral. Not because of tradition, but because Ezekiel Mitchell never believed in wasting time. He used to say that waiting makes people soft, makes them forget what they really want. The notice came by email. Same message to everyone. An address on the east side of Hartford, a time, and a single line that read, "Attendance is mandatory for claim verification." The law office of Kensington and Associates occupied the top floor of a brownstone that had been renovated but still smelled like history, wood polish, old paper, and the faint ghost of cigar smoke from another era. The conference room had a long mahogany table with folders placed at each seat, names printed in crisp black type. Victoria arrived 20 minutes early. She always did. Controls started with being first, picking the seat, setting the tone, making everyone else adjust to her. She wore gray instead of black because morning was over and positioning had begun. Her new attorney, a thin man named Gerald, who talked too much and billed too little, carried 3 binders of pre-prepared legal motions. Victoria had been ready for this day for 3 years. Grace arrived quietly, same black dress from the funeral, though she had managed to wash the blood from the cuff where her nails had dug into her palm after the slap. The bruise on her cheek had faded from angry red to a dull yellow-brown. She hadn't bothered with makeup. She took her seat at the far end of the table, folded her hands, didn't look at Victoria, didn't look at anyone. Her eyes settled on a framed quote on the wall behind the head chair. "Character is what you do when nobody is watching," her father's words. She recognized them instantly. He used to say that to her when she was little, when she asked why he always tipped the waitress extra or stopped to help strangers change flat tires. "Because nobody's watching, Gracie, and that's when it counts." The room filled. Marcus Webb, the CFO of Mitchell Holdings, took a seat near the middle. 2 board members whispered to each other near the coffee machine. Gerald organized his binders. Victoria smoothed her skirt and waited. Then the door opened, and the world tilted on its axis. The old man from the funeral walked in. No wheelchair, no torn jacket, no mismatched shoes. He stood straight, tall, moving with the kind of deliberate authority that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been born on his body. His eyes were sharp, clear, and completely focused. The room went dead silent. He set a thin briefcase at the head of the table and looked around the room with an expression that was equal parts patience and contempt. "My name is Richard Kensington," he said. His voice wasn't rough anymore. It was smooth, precise. A voice that had argued cases before the Supreme Court and never once raised itself above a conversational tone. "I am the senior executor of the Ezekiel Mitchell estate. I apologize for the theater at the funeral." But the theater was necessary. Victoria's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, fear. Gerald dropped his pen. It rolled under the table, and he didn't pick it up. Richard continued, without waiting for the room to recover. 14 months ago, Ezekiel Mitchell came to my office and asked me to design a test. Not of intelligence, not of business acumen, not of loyalty, because loyalty can be bought, and he knew that better than anyone. He paused. A test of character. He opened the briefcase. Inside were folders identical to the ones already on the table, but thicker, heavier. Mr. Mitchell believed that character reveals itself most clearly when there is no reward in sight, when kindness costs you something, when the person you are helping cannot possibly help you back. He looked at Grace. She looked back at him, and something in her chest tightened. Not fear, not confusion, something deeper, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in 16 years. "At the funeral," Richard said, "I sat in a wheelchair outside the church for 45 minutes. I was dressed in torn clothing. I appeared elderly and infirm. 197 people entered that church. Many of them are in this room right now. He paused. Let the silence do its work. One person stopped. One person left her seat at her father's casket, walked past every person who ignored me, opened the door, wheeled me inside, and gave me her own coat off her back. She was slapped across the face for doing it, and she still didn't take the coat back. Grace's breath caught. Her hand moved instinctively to her cheek, where the bruise was still fading. Richard slid a single document across the table, not to Victoria, to Grace. This is the last will and testament of Ezekiel Mitchell, executed 14 months ago and witnessed by 3 independent parties. Grace picked it up. The first line wasn't a dollar amount. It was a sentence, handwritten in her father's shaking script, scanned into the official record. If you are reading this, then someone chose kindness when it would have been easier to look away. That someone is my daughter, and she just inherited everything. Grace read it again and again. The words didn't change, but the room around her did. She could feel it shifting, like tectonic plates moving beneath a city that thought it was standing on solid ground. Everything. Every company, every property, every account, every patent, every trademark, every stock holding, every piece of real estate, every dollar of the $500 billion empire that Ezekiel Mitchell had spent 40 years building. All of it now belonged to Grace. Victoria screamed. Not a gasp, not an exclamation, a scream raw and primal, ripped from somewhere deep inside, a woman who had spent 16 years carefully constructing a fortress of control and just watched it collapse in 12 seconds. Gerald scrambled for his phone. Marcus Webb went pale. The board members looked at each other like men watching a building fall. Grace looked up from the paper. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't understand. He barely talked to me. Richard's expression softened. Just barely. Just enough for Grace to see something human behind those sharp eyes. He talked to me about you every single week for 16 years, Grace. He knew exactly what was being done to you. And he spent the last 3 years of his life making absolutely sure that when he was gone, the truth would come out, and you would get everything you deserve. Victoria's voice cut through like a blade. This is fraud. This is coercion. My lawyers will tear this apart. Richard didn't look at her. He was still looking at Grace. Your lawyers are welcome to try, Mrs. Mitchell, but I should tell you that your husband anticipated that as well. He anticipated everything. The will reading ended. Victoria stormed out. Gerald chased her. Marcus Webb made 3 phone calls before he reached the elevator. Grace sat alone in the conference room for 20 minutes, holding the document, reading her father's handwriting over and over until the words blurred. Richard waited in the hallway. When Grace finally emerged, he handed her a business card. We need to talk. Soon. There are things you need to understand before Victoria makes her next move. Grace took the card. What kind of things? The kind that will determine whether you keep what your father left you or lose it within the month. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment above the bakery, the document spread on her kitchen table beside a cup of tea that went cold hours ago. She read every page. The numbers were incomprehensible. Shell companies, holding companies, trusts within trusts, layers of financial architecture that looked like a maze designed by someone who expected people to get lost in it. Her phone buzzed constantly. Numbers she didn't recognize. Emails from people who had never responded to her before. Board members, attorneys, journalists. She ignored all of them. She called Hannah instead. So, Hannah said, "You're a billionaire now." "I think so," Grace said. "I don't really understand how it works. It works like this. You're buying dinner tomorrow. I want lobster. 2 lobsters and a side lobster and one of those chocolate lava cakes that cost $40 for no reason. Grace almost laughed. Almost. Hannah? Yeah? I'm scared. Silence on the line. Then Hannah's voice, softer now. I know, honey, but you're the strongest person I've ever met, and you've got me. And you've got that little baby girl who is going to come into this world with the most badass mama on the planet. I haven't told anyone about the baby. I know, but you will, when you're ready. Grace put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved, a flutter, like butterfly wings. The next morning, the destruction began. Grace came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find an eviction notice taped to her door. 72 hours to vacate. No explanation, no negotiation, no appeal. The building had been purchased 3 weeks earlier by a company called Whitmore Properties, LLC. Grace didn't need to look up who owned it. She sat on her bed and read the notice 4 times. 5 months pregnant, $800 in savings, nowhere to go. The next morning, she was called into her supervisor's office at the hospital. Linda Chen, who had hired Grace 3 years ago and once told her she was the best nurse on the floor, sat behind her desk with an expression that looked like someone had died. Grace, I'm sorry. We've had to make some budget cuts. Your position has been eliminated. Grace stared at her. My position, the overnight ER nurse position that's been chronically understaffed for 2 years. Linda couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry. Grace walked out of the office and past the hospital's main lobby. On the donor wall, gleaming in brushed bronze letters, was a new name. Victoria Whitmore Mitchell. $2 million contribution. Dated 3 days before the restructuring announcement. Evicted. Fired. 5 months pregnant. In 48 hours, Victoria had systematically dismantled every piece of stability Grace had built over the past decade. But Victoria wasn't finished. That night, someone knocked on Grace's apartment door. She opened it, expecting Hannah. Instead, she found Derek Lawson standing in the hallway, holding flowers, and wearing the expression of a man who had practiced looking sincere in the mirror. Derek, the man she had loved for 2 years. The man she had called at 11 at night, shaking, terrified to tell him she was pregnant. The man who had driven to her apartment, sat in her kitchen, looked her in the eyes, and said, I didn't sign up for this, Grace. This isn't what I want. Then he left. Drove away, didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up when she had her first ultrasound alone, gripping the armrest of the chair and trying not to cry when the technician asked if the father would like to see the screen. Now here he was, flowers and cologne and that calculated smile. Grace. He stepped forward. I heard about the funeral, about your father. I'm so sorry. What do you want, Derek? I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I panicked. The baby, the responsibility, it overwhelmed me. But I've been thinking, and I want to be there for you and the baby. Grace looked at him, really looked, and she saw it, the way his eyes flickered when he said, your father. The slight pause before mistake, as if he was choosing the word carefully instead of feeling it. He didn't know she was being evicted. He didn't know she had been fired. He knew about the will. Everybody knew about the will. Derek, she said, you left me in a parking lot. You said, and I quote, I didn't sign up for this. You watched me cry, and you walked away. And now you show up with grocery store flowers because you heard my last name is worth something. Grace, that's not fair. The door is behind you. He reached for her hand. She stepped back. He opened his mouth to argue. She closed the door, locked it, stood with her back against it until she heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Then she slid to the floor. At 2 in the morning, Grace sat on her bathroom floor with her knees pulled to her chest, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She had lost her home. She had lost her job. The father of her baby was a coward who only showed up when there was something to gain. Her father was dead. Her stepmother was systematically destroying her life, and $500 billion sat in accounts she couldn't access yet, couldn't use, couldn't eat. She put her hand on her stomach and whispered through the tears, "I don't know how to do this." The baby kicked, softly, like a small hand pressing back against hers, saying, "I'm here. You're not alone." Victoria moved fast. Within a week of the will reading, she filed a formal legal challenge. She hired Robert Crane, a corporate litigation attorney with 40 years of experience and a reputation for winning cases that should have been unwinnable. Gerald, her previous lawyer, was dismissed with a phone call that lasted 11 seconds. The challenge was built on 3 pillars. First, that Grace had been estranged from Ezekiel for years, and therefore the will represented an emotionally manipulated decision. Second, that Grace had no business experience and was unfit to manage a $500 billion empire. Third, and this was the blade Victoria sharpened in private, that Richard Kensington had exercised undue influence over a dying man. The hearing was scheduled before Judge Patricia Cole, 63 years old, 28 years on the bench, known for 2 things: absolute fairness and absolute intolerance for theatrics. She had once held a Fortune 500 CEO in contempt for checking his phone during testimony. She was exactly the kind of judge Victoria should have been afraid of. The courtroom was standing room only. News cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled the gallery. This was the biggest estate dispute in Connecticut history, and everyone wanted to watch it burn. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table with Richard beside her. She wore a navy blue dress that Hannah had helped her pick out, modest enough for court, loose enough to hide the pregnancy she still hadn't publicly acknowledged. Her hands were folded on the table. She looked calm. She wasn't. Victoria sat across the aisle in a cream-colored suit, her hair pulled back in a style that managed to look both elegant and sympathetic. Crane sat beside her, organized and patient, a man who understood that courtroom battles were won not with explosions, but with carefully placed charges that detonated long after they were set. Crane presented his case methodically. He painted Grace as an opportunist, a woman who had abandoned her father, built no relationship with the family business, and now stood to inherit an empire she couldn't spell, let alone manage. He cited her nursing salary, her small apartment, her lack of any corporate experience. He made it sound reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Then he called his surprise witness. Grace heard the name before she saw the face. The defense calls Derek Lawson. Her blood went cold. Derek walked to the witness stand in a suit she had never seen him wear. He was sworn in. He sat down. He didn't look at Grace, not once. Crane's questions were precise. "Mr. Lawson, how long were you in a relationship with Miss Mitchell?" 2 years. During that time, did she ever discuss her father's estate? Frequently. She talked about the money a lot. She always said she deserved more from him. She said one day it would all be hers. Grace's mouth opened. No sound came out. Did she ever express a plan to reconcile with her father? She said she was waiting for the right time. She wanted to get back into the family before anything happened to him. She said the inheritance was her backup plan. Every word was a lie. Every single word. Grace had never once talked to Derek about her father's money. She had barely talked about her father at all, because the pain of it was too deep and too private and too raw. Derek knew that. He had held her when she cried about it. He had seen the one photograph on her nightstand and asked why she only had one, and she had told him, because one was all she could bear to look at. Now he sat in a witness chair, under oath, and turned every private moment into a weapon. Crane continued, Mr. Lawson, is it your assessment that Miss Mitchell's pregnancy was planned? I believe it was strategic. She told me she wanted to have a baby because it would generate sympathy. She said people feel sorry for single mothers. The courtroom murmured. Grace couldn't breathe. She could see it now, the invisible thread connecting Derek to Victoria. Money exchanged in private, promises made in parking lots, her most intimate moments purchased and repackaged as evidence. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell every person in that room that Derek Lawson was a liar and a coward, and that the only thing strategic about her pregnancy was surviving it alone. But Richard's hand touched her arm, just barely, just enough to say, not yet. Judge Cole called a recess. Grace made it to the bathroom before the tears came. She locked herself in a stall and cried with her hand pressed over her mouth so no one could hear. Her body shook. Her baby kicked, harder this time, almost frantic, as if the baby could feel her mother's pain and wanted to fight whoever was causing it. Hannah found her. She didn't ask questions. She just sat on the bathroom floor beside her best friend and held her until the shaking stopped. He's lying, Hannah said finally. Everyone in that room, with half a brain, knows he's lying. He knows everything about me, Hannah. Every private thing I ever told him. He knows the old you, the one who didn't own half of Connecticut. Hannah pulled back and looked at her. Time to introduce him to the new one. When the hearing resumed, Richard Kensington took the stand. He moved slowly, deliberately. He sat in the witness chair like a man settling into a favorite armchair, comfortable and unhurried. Robert Crane watched him carefully, the way a chess player watches an opponent who hasn't made a mistake yet. Grace's attorney, a woman named Sarah Price, who Richard had personally selected, began the examination. Mr. Kensington, how long did you know Ezekiel Mitchell? 43 years. We met in 1981. I was a federal prosecutor. He was a 26-year-old contractor who couldn't afford a lawyer. I took his case pro bono because I believed in what he was building. I never stopped believing. In the months before his death, did Mr. Mitchell discuss his estate plan with you? Extensively. Beginning 14 months before his passing, we met weekly, sometimes more. He was very clear about what he wanted and why he wanted it. Can you describe the nature of those conversations? Richard paused. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, the voice of a man who had lost his best friend. Ezekiel knew he was dying. His doctors gave him 18 months. He used every day of it. He told me that the greatest regret of his life was not fighting harder for his daughter. He told me that Victoria had spent 16 years building a wall between them, and by the time he understood what was happening, the wall was too high to climb over. Did he provide evidence of this? He did. Richard opened a folder. Inside were documents that looked like they had been organized by someone who expected them to be questioned, because they had. Over the course of 14 months, Ezekiel Mitchell compiled a complete record of Victoria Whitmore Mitchell's activities. He hired private investigators. He engaged forensic accountants. He documented everything. Sarah Price turned to the judge. Your Honor, we would like to enter Exhibits A through M into evidence. Crane stood. Objection, we haven't had time to review these materials. Judge Cole looked at him over her glasses. You had time to spring a surprise witness on the plaintiff, Mr. Crane. I think we can find time for some documents. Overruled. The screens in the courtroom flickered to life. What appeared on them was devastating. 16 years of intercepted communications. Letters Ezekiel had written to Grace, recovered from a locked drawer in Victoria's home office. text messages deleted from Ezekiel's phone, retrieved from cloud backups Victoria didn't know existed, emails between Victoria and a private counselor she'd hired not to help Grace, but to provide Victoria with advice on how to deepen the estrangement. The courtroom went quiet, not the polite quiet of a recess. The heavy, suffocating quiet of people realizing they have been watching a crime unfold for 16 years and never noticed. Then the financial records, $47 million, systematically siphoned from Mitchell Holdings through a network of shell companies, all registered under Victoria's maiden name. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Real estate purchases in 3 states. A private jet leased through a company that existed only on paper. Marcus Webb's name appeared on 17 of the documents. He had co-signed transfers, approved budgets that didn't exist, created fictional vendor accounts. The CFO of Mitchell Holdings had been Victoria's accomplice for over a decade. Crane was on his feet. These documents are unverified. This is character assassination. Richard didn't raise his voice. He never did. They were verified by 3 independent forensic accounting firms, Mr. Crane. Their reports are included in the exhibits. They were also reviewed by the Connecticut Attorney General's office, which has opened a preliminary investigation. Victoria's face lost all color. She grabbed Crane's arm. He shook her off. Then Richard played the recording. The courtroom speakers crackled, and Ezekiel Mitchell's voice filled the room, tired, sad, but steady. Victoria has been stealing from me for years. She destroyed my relationship with my daughter. She intercepted my letters. She deleted my messages. She turned my own child against me by making Grace believe I didn't care. I didn't have the strength to fight her openly. The cancer was already spreading by the time I understood what she'd done. So I'm going to make sure that when I'm gone, the truth comes out. And Grace gets everything, because Grace is the only person in my life who ever loved me for who I was, not what I had. There was a long pause. Grace sat motionless, tears streaming down her face, her hands gripping the edge of the table. If you're hearing this, Gracie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have been stronger. I should have fought for you. Please forgive me. And please, please don't let Victoria take one more thing from this family. The recording ended. The courtroom was silent for 11 seconds. Grace counted them without meaning to. Victoria stood up. That's fabricated. That's not his voice. That's not real. Richard looked at her. It was recorded in my office on March 14th of last year. It has been certified by 3 independent audio forensic analysts. And Mrs. Mitchell, there are 14 more recordings. Would you like me to play them all? Judge Cole didn't wait for an answer. She tapped her gavel once. The challenge to the will of Ezekiel Mitchell is denied. The original will stands as written. Miss Mitchell inherits the full estate. Grace closed her eyes. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She just breathed. For the first time in weeks, she just breathed. 3 weeks of peace. That was what Grace got. 21 days that felt like coming up for air after years of drowning. She moved into a brownstone in downtown Hartford. Not the Mitchell mansion, not the estate with its 12 acres and colonial pillars and rooms full of Victoria's furniture. Grace wasn't ready for that. She chose a 3-bedroom brownstone on a tree-lined street, close enough to the hospital where she used to work that she could walk past it and remember who she was before all of this. Richard became her guide. Every morning at 8, he arrived with coffee and a stack of files, and they sat at her dining room table while he explained the architecture of her father's empire. Mitchell Holdings wasn't one company. It was 237 companies, spread across 14 industries, operating in 31 countries. Real estate, technology, Manufacturing, healthcare, energy, each one a puzzle piece in a mosaic that only Ezekiel had ever seen whole. Your father didn't build a business. Richard told her one morning. He built a city. And you're the mayor now. Grace's first board meeting was terrifying. She sat in her father's chair at the head of a table, surrounded by people who were older, richer, and more experienced than her. She could feel their skepticism like humidity, heavy and inescapable. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. I don't know this business yet, she said. I know that, but I know people. I've spent 10 years as a nurse. And the thing about nursing is that you learn very quickly who's being honest with you and who's performing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to learn, I'm going to listen, and I'm going to ask questions that might seem basic to you. But I promise you this, I won't make a decision I don't understand, and I won't pretend to understand something I don't. The room was quiet. Then Richard, standing near the back, began to clap. Slowly, others joined. Grace's first executive action was to reinstate 400 employees Victoria Foyt had laid off to inflate quarterly earnings. She called each department personally. An assembly line worker in the Pittsburgh factory cried on the phone. My daughter asked me every night when I was going back to work. I didn't know what to tell her. Grace said, "Tell her Monday." Hannah called that evening. So, how was your first day as Empress of the Universe? Exhausting. I made a woman in accounting cry because I told her she wasn't getting fired. See? You're already better at this than Victoria. She made people cry for the opposite reason. That's progress. Grace laughed. A real laugh, deep and unexpected. It felt like finding a room in her house she'd forgotten existed. She had her 6-month ultrasound with Hannah by her side. The technician moved the wand across her stomach, and there she was on the screen. A baby girl, fingers and toes, and a heartbeat that filled the room like a tiny drum. Hannah held the ultrasound photo up to the light. She already has your stubborn face. She has your attitude. Look at that fist. That's my goddaughter. She came into this world ready to fight. Grace put the photo in her wallet right next to the picture of her parents in the apple orchard. 2 generations of Mitchell women. One who was lost, one who survived, and one who was on her way. Investors stabilized. The markets responded positively to the leadership change. Local news ran a feature titled, "The Nurse Who Inherited an Empire and Chose Compassion." Grace read it in bed that night, eating ice cream out of the carton, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She shouldn't have. The call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the court ruling. Grace was in her father's old office, reviewing budget proposals, when Richard walked in without knocking. He never walked in without knocking. "We have a problem," he said. Marcus Webb had not been idle. The CFO had spent the past 3 weeks building a case, quietly, methodically, with the desperate energy of a man who knows that if the forensic accountants dig deep enough, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He had bribed a doctor at Hartford General to produce falsified medical records, suggesting that Ezekiel Mitchell had been suffering from severe cognitive decline in the months before his death. He had convinced 3 board members, men who owed their positions to Victoria's patronage, to join an internal coup. And he had prepared a motion for an emergency vote to remove Grace as executor, pending a competency review of the will. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that someone, and Richard couldn't yet prove who, had leaked Grace's medical records from the company health plan she'd enrolled in after taking control. Her pregnancy was now public knowledge. Grace saw the headline on her phone before Richard could tell her. "Mitchell Hare, pregnant and alone. Is she fit to run a $500 billion empire?" The article was devastating, not because it said anything explicitly cruel, but because it said everything implicitly. Unmarried, no listed father, emotional vulnerability, high-risk decision-making. It painted a picture of a woman who was in over her head, drowning in hormones and sentimentality, unfit to manage a lemonade stand, let alone a global corporation. Grace's phone rang. Victoria. She answered without thinking. Sweetie? Victoria's voice was warm, concerned, dripping with the kind of manufactured care that she had perfected over 16 years. I just saw the news. I'm so worried about you. A single mother trying to run a corporation of this size. It's too much for anyone, let alone someone in your condition. Your father would have wanted what's best for the baby. Grace hung up. Her hands were shaking. Victoria called again. Grace didn't answer, but the damage was done. The board meeting that afternoon was a bloodbath. Marcus presented his evidence with the calm precision of a man who had rehearsed every word. The medical records, the cognitive decline narrative, the pregnancy, the lack of experience. He framed it as concern. We're not trying to remove Grace permanently. We're simply asking for a temporary review period to ensure the company is protected during this transition. The vote was 7-5, against Grace. Security escorted her out of her father's building. She stood on the sidewalk, 8 months pregnant, holding a cardboard box of personal items. The framed quote from her father's office, "Character is what you do when nobody is watching," fell out of the box, and the glass cracked on the concrete. She stood there for a long time, looking at the broken glass on the sidewalk, the words still visible through the fractures. People walked past her. Cars honked. The city moved forward, indifferent, relentless, alive. Her phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. Check your email. She opened her email. There was a message from Victoria's attorney, a formal offer to settle. Victoria would take control of Mitchell Holdings. Grace would receive a monthly stipend of $50,000 and a house in Ashford. In exchange, Grace would sign away all claims to the estate and agree to a permanent non-disclosure agreement. $50,000 a month. It sounded like a lot. It was nothing. It was pocket change scraped from the floor of an empire that was rightfully hers. At the bottom of the email, in small type, "This offer expires in 72 hours. Victoria was giving her 3 days. The same number of days she'd given Grace to vacate her apartment. That night, Grace sat in Hannah's spare bedroom. Everything was gone again. The company, the security, the future she was building for her daughter. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Derek. She should have ignored it. She knew that. But at 3 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, sitting in a borrowed room with nothing left, you don't always make the decision you would make in the daylight. Grace. His voice was different now, shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the confident liar who had sat on the witness stand. I know what they did. Victoria, Marcus. I know about the coup. Grace, I'm sorry. She promised me money, $200,000, and I was weak. I was stupid. I want to help fix this. I'll recant my testimony. I'll tell the truth. Grace closed her eyes. She wanted to believe him. Every tired, broken, desperate part of her wanted to believe that one person in her life was capable of doing the right thing. Meet me, Derek said. I'll explain everything. There's a restaurant on Main Street, the one we used to go to, tomorrow at noon. She agreed. She shouldn't have. When Grace arrived at the restaurant the next day, the paparazzi were waiting. 8 cameras, 4 news vans. Derek stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets, and when he saw her, his expression told her everything she needed to know. He had sold her out, again, for the second time. The headline that evening, "Disgraced heiress spotted with ex who testified against her. Reconciliation or conspiracy. Victoria's attorneys filed a supplemental motion within hours. The photos were evidence, they argued, that Grace and Derek had been working together all along to defraud the Mitchell estate. Grace sat in Hannah's apartment that night alone. Hannah was working a double shift. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. She picked up the cracked frame from the sidewalk. The glass was spiderwebbed, but the words were still clear. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't do this. I'm not strong enough." Silence. The apartment had no answers. The frame had no answers. The dead have no answers for the living. Then the baby kicked, hard, so hard that Grace gasped, a tiny fist pressing against the inside of her belly with a force that seemed impossible for someone who weighed less than 4 pounds. "Get up," the kick said. "Get up, Mama. We're not done." Richard Kensington arrived at Hannah's apartment at 7 the next morning. He looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was wrinkled, which for Richard was the equivalent of a full emotional breakdown, but his eyes were clear, bright, alive with something that Grace recognized after a moment as anticipation. "Your father," Richard said, setting his briefcase on the kitchen table, "was the smartest man I ever knew, and the most paranoid. And in this case, the paranoia was the smartest part." Grace poured him coffee. Her hands were steady now. The baby had kicked something loose inside her the night before, some final reservoir of self-pity that had been holding her down. And when she woke up this morning, she found that it had drained away in the night, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more useful. Clarity. "Tell me," she said. Richard opened his briefcase. "Ezekiel didn't write one will. He wrote 3. Grace sat down slowly. "The first will is the one that was read publicly, the one that gave you everything. That was the surface. The bait, if you will. The bait for what? For exactly what happened. Victoria's challenge, the coup, the attempt to remove you and reinstall herself." Richard pulled out a document, thick, dense, with legal language. "The second will is a failsafe. It was filed under seal with the Connecticut Probate Court 14 months ago, with instructions to activate automatically if any party successfully challenged the first will and gained temporary control of Mitchell Holdings." What does it activate? A federal audit, not a corporate audit, not a state audit. Federal. IRS, SEC, FBI. Every transaction within Mitchell Holdings going back 20 years. Every account, every transfer, every signature. Grace stared at him. Victoria triggered a federal audit by winning. She triggered it by cheating. That's the difference. If the challenge had been legitimate, filed in good faith by a reasonable party, the second will would never have activated. But the second will includes criteria: falsified medical records, bribed witnesses, board manipulation. Victoria hit all 3. She essentially filled out the application for her own investigation. The coffee went cold in Grace's cup. She didn't notice. "And the third will?" she asked. Richard paused. For the first time in the week she had known him, he looked emotional. His jaw tightened. His eyes got bright. "The third will," he said, "is a letter from your father, addressed to you, and it contains everything. Every piece of evidence Ezekiel gathered during the last 3 years of his life: financial records, recordings, sworn affidavits from former employees. Evidence that Marcus Webb and Victoria Whitmore Mitchell have been committing securities fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion since 2019. He knew, Grace said. He knew she would fight. He knew she would cheat. And he built a trap that only works if she does exactly what she did. Richard looked at her across the table. Your father designed this so that the harder Victoria fights, the deeper she buries herself. Every motion she filed, every witness she bribed, every document she falsified, it all becomes evidence. She's been building the prosecution's case for them. Grace picked up the cracked frame, looked at the words behind the broken glass. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. He planned for me to lose, she said quietly. Richard nodded. He planned for you to be tested. Anyone can win from a position of power, Grace. He wanted to know if you'd fight from the floor. And you did. Every single time. Grace set the frame down, looked at Richard. How long until the audit kicks in? It already has. Federal agents have been reviewing Mitchell Holdings' account since the 6 a.m. this morning. Does Victoria know? Not yet. Grace stood up, put her coffee in the sink, straightened her shoulders. Call a board meeting, she said. Tomorrow morning. All members present, no exceptions. Richard studied her. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish what my father started. The boardroom of Mitchell Holdings occupied the 42nd floor of the glass tower Ezekiel built with his own hands. On a clear day, you could see 4 states from the windows. Today the sky was cloudless. Everything was sharp and bright and inescapable. Victoria arrived early, of course. She sat in the CEO chair she had occupied for less than 3 weeks, and she looked triumphant. Marcus Webb stood beside her, tablet in hand, running through the morning agenda like a man who had already won. 3 complicit board members sat in their chairs with the satisfied expressions of people who believe they have backed the right horse. The door opened at 9 a.m. exactly. Grace walked in, 8.5 months pregnant, wearing a simple white dress. No jewelry, no briefcase, no entourage. Just Grace and Richard, who carried nothing but a flash drive the size of a thumbnail. Victoria smirked. This meeting isn't open to former executives, sweetheart. Grace didn't respond to Victoria. She walked to the presentation screen at the front of the room, plugged in the flash drive, and pressed play. The screens around the boardroom lit up like windows into hell. 20 years of financial records. Every shell company Victoria had created, organized chronologically, with bank account numbers and transaction histories. Every wire transfer Marcus had approved, matched with the corresponding fake vendor invoices. Every forged signature side by side with the authentic ones, the differences highlighted in red. Every offshore account, every real estate purchase, every private jet lease, every dollar of the $47 million that had been stolen from the company Ezekiel Mitchell spent his life building. Marcus jumped to his feet. Where did you get that? Richard's voice was calm. From the man who built everything in this room, including the trap you just walked into. The screens changed. New documents appeared. The second will, now unsealed. The federal audit order, already signed. The FBI warrants, already executed. And a timeline showing that federal agents had entered the building at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting began. They were already here, downstairs, in the finance department, in Marcus's office, in the server room. They had been here all morning, and nobody had told Victoria because nobody who knew had any reason to warn her. Victoria stood. Her face was the color of ash, the same color it had been at the funeral when the old man in the wheelchair stood up. But this time, there was no recovery, no plan B, no back door. You can't do this, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. I'll fight this. I'll appeal. You'll what, Victoria? Grace's voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just present. Slap me again? The room went silent. Every person at that table remembered the funeral, the sound, the blood on Grace's cheek, the 214 people who did nothing. Grace continued. 16 years. You stole 16 years from my father. You stole his letters. You stole his voice. You stole his money. You convinced a dying man that his own daughter didn't love him. And 3 weeks ago, you stole my company. She paused, looked around the room, at the board members who had voted against her, at Marcus, who was already sweating through his shirt, at Victoria, whose hands were shaking. But you forgot one thing, Grace said. My father didn't build this for you. He built it for me. And he spent the last 3 years of his life making absolutely sure that no matter what you did, no matter how hard you fought, no matter how many people you bribed or threatened or manipulated, the truth would come out, because that's who he was. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. And that's who I am. The boardroom door opened. 2 FBI agents entered, followed by 4 more. Professional, quiet, inevitable. Marcus Webb was handcuffed first. He started crying before they finished reading his rights. Loud, messy, undignified tears. The tears of a man who spent years believing he was too smart to get caught and just discovered he was wrong. Victoria was handcuffed second. She didn't cry. She stood perfectly still while the agent secured the cuffs, and she looked at Grace the entire time. Her expression was complicated. Layers of hatred and calculation and something else. Something Grace almost didn't recognize because she had never seen it on Victoria's face before. Respect. As they led her toward the door, Victoria stopped. The agents paused. He loved you, Victoria said quietly. I knew that. I always knew that. I just thought if I could make you disappear, his love would have nowhere to go except to me. She paused. It doesn't work that way, does it? No, Grace said. It doesn't. Victoria nodded once. Then they let her out. The 3 board members who had voted for the coup resigned before lunch. They weren't charged, but they would never sit on another board again. Derek Lawson was arrested for perjury the following week. He called Grace's phone 17 times from the county jail. She never answered. There is a moment somewhere between crisis and calm when everything you have been carrying falls away and you are left standing in the quiet, lighter than you have ever been. Grace felt it that afternoon, sitting alone in her father's office for the first time since the coup. The room smelled like leather and old wood, and faintly, she imagined, like him. Richard brought her a box, the last box from Ezekiel's private safe. Inside were 212 letters, envelopes addressed to Grace Mitchell in her father's handwriting, each one dated, each one sealed. 16 years of letters, every birthday, every Christmas, every random Tuesday when Ezekiel sat at his desk and wrote to a daughter he thought had forgotten him. Grace opened the first one, dated 6 months after Victoria arrived. Dear Gracie, I moved your bedroom today. Victoria said you needed space, but I don't think that's true. I think I'm making a mistake. I just don't know what kind yet. I miss hearing you laugh. The house is too quiet. I love you, Dad. She opened the next one, and the next, and the next. She read them for 3 days. She cried for most of it. Deep, shaking, 16 years of silenced tears that left her empty and clean like a house after a flood. Damaged but still standing, she put them in a fireproof safe beside her mother's photograph. 2 women who loved her, 1 who raised her, 1 who was coming. Grace went into labor on a Thursday afternoon during a board meeting. Her water broke mid-sentence, right in the middle of approving the new employee benefits package, which she later said was appropriate because the benefits package included 12 weeks of paid parental leave. Hannah drove 90 miles an hour in a Subaru that was not designed for 90 miles an hour. I delivered 1 baby in nursing school, Hannah shouted over the sound of the engine. "And I will not be delivering this one in a Subaru. Just drive, Hannah." Richard followed in a town car, on the phone with the hospital administrator, demanding the best room, the best doctor, and fresh flowers, which Grace had not requested, but which he felt were important. "Hannah," Richard's voice came through the speakerphone, "you've run 4 red lights. 5, the 5th one was orange. Charlotte Catherine Mitchell was born at 7:32 p.m., 7 pounds 4 ounces. She had Grace's eyes and her grandmother Catherine's chin and a grip strength that made the delivery nurse laugh and say, 'That one's going to be trouble.'" Grace held her daughter in the hospital room while the last light of the day came through the window and painted everything gold. Richard stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes wet for the first and only time Grace would ever see. Hannah was asleep in the visitor's chair, still wearing the scrubs she'd had on during the drive, snoring softly. On the windowsill, in a new frame, with the crack still visible underneath, sat her father's quote, "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." Grace looked at her daughter's face, so small, so new, so completely unaware of the empire that waited for her, the fortune that bore her name, the war that had been fought before she took her first breath. "Your grandfather built something incredible," Grace whispered. "Your grandmother was the bravest woman I ever knew. Your mama was a night shift nurse who talked to old men in wheelchairs and got slapped for it. And you, little one, you are the reason all of it matters." Charlotte yawned, a tiny, perfect yawn. Grace smiled, not for the cameras that would come tomorrow, not for the board that would need her on Monday, not for the $500 billion empire that she had never wanted, but would protect with everything she had. She smiled because her daughter was here, because the letters had been found, because the truth had come out, the way her father always knew it would, and because for the first time in her life, Grace Mitchell was not invisible. Outside the hospital window, the city of Hartford moved forward, cars and lights and lives, all pressing on toward tomorrow. The Mitchell empire endured, the cracked frame held, and somewhere, in whatever quiet place the dead go when their work is finally done, Ezekiel Mitchell rested. His daughter was home. This is a story about what kindness costs and what it returns. It is about the people who show up when nobody is watching and the price paid by those who only perform when the cameras are on. If you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel invisible, this story was written for you. If you are ready, stay with me. This is going to change the way you see every stranger you walk past tomorrow. And if this story moves you, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because stories like this do not just entertain. They remind us who we are supposed to be. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with real-life lessons. Every word was crafted with purpose because we believe great stories deserve more than shortcuts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this community.